Welcome everyone to CovYouth 101. Today we have a great topic we're going to be talking about, and that is helping students and families in crisis. CovYouth 101 is a webinar series that our interim leadership team is putting together to help all of our youth leaders to be able to get a handle on the basics, the core, the essential skills that are required to be able to thrive in youth ministry. We've had some great ones this year, and today's topic, I think, fits right in with that top tier level of things that youth leaders need to be able to understand and the skills they need to have to do well. So this will show up in our CovYouth 101 area on CovYouth, and if this is your first one to see, then I encourage you to go back and check out the others, because there's about 8 or 9 other that are there. So today I am welcoming a special guest. His name is Drew Williams, and he is with Covenant Youth of Alaska. And he has brought with him a special guest of his own that I'll let him introduce here in just a moment, tell you about his history and who he is, and then he's going to begin by sharing about his experience with helping students and families in crisis. But I just want to introduce, begin by just saying thank you, Drew. And I've known Drew for a long time, ever since he was a student coming to Thunder and Mud in the Pacific Northwest Conference. And it's really been fun to see him grow and develop as a leader, and especially to watch him in a very challenging and unique context there in Alaska, where helping students and families in crisis is part of his day-to-day activity. Everything is every day, and he handles it so well. And so I'm really proud of you, and I'm impressed by the leader that you've become. And I'm really glad to have you with us today, Drew. So welcome. Glad you're here. Take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. As Eric said, my name is Drew Williams, and I work with Covenant Youth of Alaska. I am originally from the Pacific Northwest. Grew up at Cascade Covenant, and going to camp in the Pacific Northwest, and did many Covenant things in that world for a very long time. But now I live and work in the Alaska Conference, and I have been 10 years in the village of Scammon Bay. If you want to see how remote I am, just Google 99662. That's our zip code. And this is my daughter, who's going to be very distracting all day long. This is Zoe, and she's new-ish. She'll be 7 months old in 3 days. And so you might hear her doing that and singing while we're doing. I'm going to try and distract her as best I can so that we can get this done. But if you hear some background noises, I am the at-home parent while my wife teaches. She teaches at the local school here. And so that's just a little bit about me. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to put this one down and see if she'll eat, and then we'll get into it. All right. So I wanted to start out just with the topic of dealing with families in crisis. I wanted to start out pretty intentionally about talking about the things that I am not, in terms of like my credentials and things like that, because I'm actually not a very credentialed person. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a licensed counselor. I'm not ordained. So there's probably a bunch of people watching this who have more credentials than I do. But what I do have is an experience in a very specific context that's a decade long. And so I live and work in the midst of trauma, and the people I work with are traumatized people, both historically and in their own, just in their own lives. I myself have dealt with trauma and am a trauma survivor. And I, like you, am a youth worker who cares deeply about the kids in my care and their families. And I think that's a really important distinction. It's youth ministry, especially when dealing with crisis, is a family affair. You can't really deal with crisis, true crisis, without also dealing with the families. And I connect regularly with students who deal with drug and alcohol abuse in their home. I work in the presence of extreme poverty. I have ministered to the children of parents who have died extremely violent deaths. I have sat with parents who dwindled away from cancer. I ministered to parents who are and have been abusers, which is not something we always talk about. And in the 10 years that I have been in Scammon Bay, I have been to 2 weddings, but I've been to probably 25 funerals, and that's all in a community of less than
Wow.
1,000 people. Um,
Wow.
and that's somewhat normal. That's somewhat normalized in Western Alaska. Trauma and death are not distant, sterilized things in our context. We deal with it fairly often. We talk about it a lot. We're tired of it. And we talk about that a lot, but they're very present. They're very in your face in my particular community. And sometimes I like to say that I've become an accidental expert on trauma, as most who are in healthcare or social services or youth ministry in my context or similar contexts are, which is something you deal with almost by osmosis. And so it's just part of our regular rhythm to be on call. And so like I could get a call in 5 minutes and there could be a crisis and I'll have to go, because of our context and the way that things work here. But an important thing for me to say is that I am not making plans to go anywhere. There are beautiful things, wonderful things about my community and Western Alaskan communities. And I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I'm raising my daughter in this community. And I think it's going to be a great place for her to grow up. I think I'm excited for her to go to school here. I'm excited for her to make friends here. I'm excited it's been fun for me in the midst of a community that deals with hard things to also see a community that cares for my daughter, even though we are outsiders. I am not Native Alaskan. I am not an indigenous person. I have to cross a lot of ocean before I become indigenous. But to watch the people we live with and care for my family, even in the midst of all the many things, has been really cool. And we're not making plans to leave. God might move us, but he hasn't said yet. So yeah, it's important.
That's
It's
great.
really, really important for me to mention that, though, that there are hard things, but even in the midst of all the hard things and all the issues, I'm a firm believer that this is a good place to be. So
That's great. Well, Joe, I really appreciate your faithfulness. 10 years there in Alaska is a long time. You're already just in that amount of time, like the veteran, right? And you serve as our conference coach in Alaska, and I know you direct camps and that kind of stuff. So it is a challenging area, and your faithfulness and commitment to be there is admirable. So good job. Well done. Thank you.
thanks, Eric.
So I've looked through your notes, and I'm super excited about what you have to share. I know you have some like highlights of things that are important to know as you come into this. What I love about your testimony is that it sounds like you are more of like a on-the-job training, kind of in working with people with crisis as opposed to having the academic training. And there's just such a, meaty helpfulness in learning by actually serving people as opposed to reading books about it. So I think you got a lot of really great things to share. So thank you again. And so go ahead and keep going. And I love your first thing, the importance of sympathy. Go ahead and jump into that.
Yeah. So first thing I really want to talk about is the importance of sympathy, because I feel like we talk a lot about empathy in the modern conversation of emotions and dealing with students and dealing with other people. We talk a lot about empathy, but I want to talk about sympathy, which is a lot of times kind of a little bit of a dirty word. People talk about sympathy in a negative context, but I want to reframe that a little bit, where sympathy equals understanding and empathy equals experience. So, for instance, if you have had a loved one who has passed away from cancer, you are able to have empathy with somebody who is going through that experience. If you have not had a family member who has passed away from cancer, and you are helping with somebody who's going through that experience. You can't actually have empathy in that experience. You can have sympathy, and you can understand them. You can conceptualize it, but it's a really important distinction when dealing with crisis, especially when we're kind of frontline emotional workers, or emotional frontline emotional care as youth workers, I'll say. And so it's really important to not try too hard to step over into empathy when you don't actually have those experiences, because then you end up owning a crisis that isn't actually yours. And so, and sympathy, again, is I think is misunderstood, in that people think it's just like, oh, it'll be okay, and like pat pat pat, and like that's not what I'm talking about, but I'm talking about like have real understanding, have real care, but don't own things that aren't yours. That's a really important distinction when dealing with crisis, because it's really easy for people who care in the way that we do and in the fields that we work to really kind of step into a crisis and a little bit make it your own in an attempt to do better care. But I don't actually think it does do better care. I think you can do great care without actually owning someone else's experience, and sympathy can get you there even if you haven't been through the experience. And hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
I also want to talk about, like, there's little crisis and there's big crisis. So like little crisis might be, what's an example? So like if a kid doesn't get into the college that they're trying to get into, you're working with a senior and they're really excited about going to this college and they don't get into that college. That might be a little crisis. Whereas a big crisis might be like if there's a school shooting in your town. That's a big crisis, right? And there's a huge gap between those two things, right? But if you're the student in both situations, no matter the size of the crisis, it's a very real experience for your student. And I've seen a lot of people, a lot of very well-meaning youth workers, camp counselors, volunteers who hear a little crisis and they really downplay it. And they're just like, oh, that's not a big deal, or oh, that's not blah blah blah, or that's, and they really minimize that experience because it is a small crisis, right? Speaking of small crisis,
Yeah, feel free to pause anytime you need to take care of it.
Yeah, really minimizing those small crises. But it's important, and this is something we know, but I don't know that we often think about kind of academically or whatever. But like, whatever crisis your student is going with is a very real crisis for them. And your reaction to their small crisis will gauge if they're going to bring you the next crisis, which may be a bigger crisis, right? And it's about becoming a safe person. So for instance, like you have two students in your youth ministry who are in a toxic relationship with one another. You know it's bad, and you wish, I'm dealing with this right now in my youth ministry, where there's some toxic relationships that I wish would end. But say they break up, and that's a very good thing that these two students have broken up. But one of the two students comes to you and is in tears and is in a breakdown and is in free fall because they've never gone through this before. And if you are someone who takes their experience and their very real, very raw emotion and minimizes it, I don't think that's a good thing. I think in that moment you should have sympathy, likely empathy, because many of us have been through a first breakup. And even if it's not a big deal to you, if they're bringing it up, it's a big deal to them. And don't minimize people's emotional experience, because it gauges what comes next. Because if a student is able to bring the little crisis to you, they're much more likely and going to be much more comfortable bringing the big crisis to you, right? And it's it's also important to have other leaders and other adults to debrief the nonsense and be like, yay, the toxic relationship is done, but like not in the moment. And And something that I often tell people, just in kind of trying to gauge how we respond in little crisis, is that the pain is very real for that student, for their experience. And like, speak to that. Don't maybe necessarily speak to the actual situation, because sometimes the situation is ridiculous in little crisis, and we know that. But the pain that a student is feeling is very, very real for them, and like, the emotions are very raw, and like, speak to those things. I think it's also important, like, we talk about little crisis, we talk about big crisis, and there's this huge spectrum in between, of talking about discernment. Like, how do we determine, like, what's a little crisis, what's a big crisis? Your number one tool in determining kind of the level of crisis for a student, because some students are dramatic, some students are just stonewall, and your biggest tool in gauging the level of crisis with a student is the relationships that you have. It's huge to know your students. Like, students you know better, you know what their facial expressions mean. You know what it means if they're sitting with a different group of kids. You know what it means if they don't show up to the thing that they always show up to. Like, there's all these little cues with students that we know really well. And engaging kind of like, man, is this a big deal? Is this not a big deal? Like, your number one tool is going to be relationship, and your network of relationships too, right? You have leaders, you're close with parents, you've got maybe other staff with your church who also have these relationships. And so really leveraging those relationships to kind of get at, what is the student going through? How are they feeling? What is a proper, appropriate response? We're going to talk a little bit later about systems, and like the systems for like dealing with big crisis. But I think in the topic of discernment, just having some base level training is also really good. There's really good tools from Ministry Safe, which I know a lot of camps use and a lot of youth groups use to train their volunteer staff. But like, I know I run our camp up here in Alaska, or I'm one of the people who helps run it. And we make anyone who's coming on staff, regardless of if they've come to camp 100 times, or if they've come to camp 1,000 times, or if they started camp 30 years ago, I make them go through that training, right? I don't care how many times they've done it. I don't care how many times. I don't care what their normal life is, what their context is. They're going through the base level training for recognizing abuse, for recognizing when things are off with students, because it's the veggies on the plate. Like, you got to just keep eating it, and like, it's not the fun thing, but like, it's really important to always be re-hitting kind of those base levels. And if you haven't done a training like that, do it. Like, there's no other excuse besides that. Like, if you haven't gone through a basic training for recognizing abuse, find a way. There's stuff online, there's books, but Ministry Safe is the best one, I think. All the things I've seen, they make it easy, it's self-paced, and it doesn't take a super long time, and you can give it to a lot of people. So highly encourage that. And I would say, if you're going to be working with anyone who is under 18 in any capacity, you must go through a base level recognizing abuse training of some capacity. And I will die on that hill.
I'll be right there with you.
Yeah. Another thing I want to talk about is the importance of team, really. And it's funny because, like, my youth ministry, I don't have a team, it's just me, but I do have people that I do this with, even though they're not in the room, right? And my context is different, and so, like, a lot of the examples I'm giving, and actually a lot of the advice I'm going to give, is stuff that I can't actually do because of my own context. But we'll get into that later, right? Excuse me. So don't neglect. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tim.
No, continue, sir. I didn't interrupt you.
Yeah. So So the last thing I'll talk about in discernment is to not neglect a time of debrief. So if you have a team, I know a lot of youth ministries, you meet in the beginning and then the night ends and everybody just kind of filters away and goes home. I think that's a little bit of a mistake. I think there should be somewhat of a time of debrief at the end of a night or the end of an event where you talk about what happened tonight. And you can say, oh man, like, Susie seemed off, or like Bill was weird, and like, or whatever. But really the importance of debrief, because it is a form of debrief is a form of group discernment. And in the church, we believe in group discernment. We believe that sometimes my brain is a stupid brain, and so I need other brains to help me discern the world and see reality. I do this with my wife a lot. My wife is a teacher here in the school. There's 100% crossover between her students and my students, just in different contexts. She has them in the classroom. I have them in the fellowship hall, right? And so I can talk about. We have the shared knowledge of students, and we can say, man, like, she seemed really off, or man, like, he was really angry about something tonight, and she can go, oh yeah, this happened, or I can say, oh yeah, this is what he talked about. And it's a safe space for me to debrief kind of what is happening. But it's also, again, just that group discernment of like, how big is this issue? Like, is this a problem? Is this a known entity? Is this something that's being dealt with? I have the privilege, I'll call it a privilege, of where I'm really close with the school. I'm really close with the school staff. I'm invited. I can go over there anytime within my context. I'm really close with our school counselor. So if stuff comes up at youth group, I can go to our school counselor and say like, hey, this came up. Is she talking with you about this? Do you know that this is happening? And more often than not, she goes, yeah, we talk about that all the time. And I go, cool, and I leave it there, right? And or we work together and we call who needs to be called, and there's crossover there. So group discernment, super important, and sooner rather than later. I see group things and group discernment happen after the fact a lot. But I would highly encourage you to move towards, like, again, the end of event or the end of a youth group night, or after a church service or whatever. Don't just kind of fizzle away, but take 3 minutes, take 5 minutes, and just put your heads together and say, hey, was anything significant? Is there anything people need to be aware of? Is anyone confused by any interaction that happened? And then disperse away. So hopefully that's helpful.
Great. That's really helpful. I was just going to mention that anybody that's coming to Unite, that training is required to become a leader, to come along that. And if you need like pointing direction for those resources, you can check out the area in Unite that has leader preparation. And we also previously did an entire webinar on safety training. And so check that out too. And within the body of that webinar, we have links and stuff, so Ministry Safe and other kind of locations. So, and so, Drew, before you continue, I just want to encourage anybody that's watching, if a question comes up, feel free to put it in the chat and go along. We will do our best to answer those at the end, or if it seems appropriate, I'll interrupt you with a question.
And I do have the chat open as well. So
okay, good.
I can see it in real time. So when Eric asked me to share, I was trying to think of like what's my biblical base for crisis response, because I do think that that's important. I do think we don't just kind of work out of a clinical sense or out of a cultural sense even sometimes, but like really what is like, where does my response, what's my anchor for crisis response biblically? And what I kept coming back to was Psalm 23. Yeah, Tim, Old Testament is exactly right. Old Testament is crisis after crisis after crisis, and it's not always handled well. But Psalm 23 is what I keep coming back to. And I just think it's a very poignant picture of reality and how God is working in the midst of crisis. and I've spoken a lot on Psalm 23. I've given a lot of sermons on Psalm 23. I've talked about Psalm 23 a lot. I've probably spent more time in this passage in the last 10 years than any other passage. Just because I don't know, it's kind of the safety blanket when things are hard, it feels like. And and if you read it at face value, it really doesn't seem like it should be that, but it is, right? Because in Psalm 23, God doesn't promise to pull us out of the valleys, right? He doesn't say like go around the valley. He doesn't even say come out the other side of the valley, right? He just says that when I'm in the valley, I'm there with you. He doesn't promise to pull us away from our enemies. He says he prepares a table for us in the presence of our enemies. And he promises good things even in the reality of darkness, even in the reality of valley, even in the reality of enemies present. And it's this very it's very similar to in this life you will have trouble, right? But it's more of a relational response from God of like, things are going to be hard. There will be hard things, and you will walk in shadow at times. And like, but even when that happens, like, it's not necessarily a lonely place. It's not necessarily like a place of solitude, but it is a place of difficulty, and that difficulty is not ever minimized, right? Sometimes I talk a lot with our students about how the gospel needs to engage with their real life, right? Just a fun little language cultural lesson. I work with Yupik people, and YUP''IK, and the word Yupik literally translated means the real people. And so I talk a lot with our students about how they should be real people, and they have real lives, they have real hurt, they have real joys, they have real wins, and they have real losses. And if the gospel is not engaging them in those real spaces, then it's a half gospel. It's not a full truth. And so so my question for us is, in our ministries, does our ministry encourage students to deal with an idealized version of their life or with their actual life? Because like, we talk about death in our youth group, we talk about substance abuse, we talk about physical abuse, we talk about these things, and we don't just like we do it with tact, and we do it with care in mind, and we do it specifically, not generally. But are we teaching about things that our students are dealing with, or are we just doing things, is kind of the question. And that might sound like kind of a harsh criticism, but I think it's important, because again, our students they're real people with real lives and real wins, real losses, real joy, and real pain, and the gospel should be encompassing all of those things. And another way I could frame this question is, do we talk with our students more about where they are or more about where they should be? And I think both are important, but if you don't ever establish where a student is in that moment, you can't really ever get to where they should be, right? It goes back to that relationship thing again, right? We need to allow your students to be real, allow your students to share hard things, allow them to be crass, allow them to be in these private spaces, allow them to put their real self out there, right? Because again, they have real joys, real pains, real wins, real losses, and we need to engage the full spectrum of their human experience, because that's what the gospel is. That's the whole point of why Jesus came, to engage with the whole spectrum of our human experience. And if we're not allowing our students to do that, then dealing with crisis is going to be really hard. Because if we've only ever talked about joy, if we've only ever talked about grace, if we've only ever talked about forgiveness, when somebody dies, it's going to be a lot harder of a conversation. When there's a crisis at their school, it's going to be a lot harder of a conversation. When a student gets really sick, it's going to be a lot harder of a conversation, right? I highly encourage everyone to discard and throw away the phrase, "it is okay," or the phrase, "it is going to be okay," because some things simply aren't going to be okay. If a student's mother just died, it's not going to be okay. It's just not. And that doesn't mean that they can't function. It doesn't mean that they can't move forward. It doesn't mean that they can't go on to have full things, but it will never be okay that their mother is dead. Right? It's a useless phrase. Yes, Marcus in the chat says it is okay to mourn with them. I would say it is necessary to mourn with them. We, particularly in the Western Church, particularly in the white Western Church, we have really sterilized. Mourning. We leave it to this other space, right? We have really. I'm gonna try and stop the singing. Come here, you. We have really sterilized. We've really sterilized kind of the process of mourning and grieving and lament. We don't do lament well as the church. We just don't. We don't talk about it. When there's tragedies, we talk about hope. We talk about growth. We talk about what can be built, but we don't often sit in the mourning. We don't often sit in the shadow for just a minute. We immediately move to what's next. And I would highly encourage you, and that is all, I think that is all in an attempt to make us okay, right? Things are uncomfortable, things are poor, things are, I don't like the way it is, so I immediately want to change it so that I can be okay. But I think sitting in the moment, sitting in kind of the terrible, there's a lot of really cool things that God does in those moments. I mean, Tim mentioned the Old Testament, right? Like there are a lot of dark nights of the soul in the Old Testament where God does incredible, incredible things. And we need to embrace those rather than try and just move on from them. I think that's really important, to not move on too quickly. Right. The example I'll give is in our community, in our context, when someone dies, we do wakes, and wakes are 3 days. And I need 2 minutes. Someone is incessantly knocking on my door. I will be right back.
Okay, that's all right. We'll have Jim, who edits our videos, edit this part out. But while Drew is checking his door, I was just going to mention that I agree that one of the biggest and most important elements of helping our students and families that are in crisis is to just be with them and sit with them in that lament space. That oftentimes they're not looking for solutions or an answer or even an offer of hope it's going to be okay. They just want to know that they have people alongside them that are with them. So I second that for sure.
Yeah, super important. I also embrace the power of silence as well. Again, we in the Western Church, and particularly the white Western Church, are very uncomfortable with silence. But I would highly encourage you to do your best to embrace just sitting with another person. I know a lot of chaplains, and most of what they do is sit in silence with people. Sometimes it's not going to be okay, right? If you have terminal cancer, it's not going to be okay. If you've just lost a family member, it's not going to be okay, right? If there are some things that are just not okay. We live in a broken world, and we know that, and a lot of times we try and make things okay that aren't going to be okay, and we shouldn't do that. I like to quote Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek, who talks about, or has a quote that says, it's possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not a weakness, that is life. And I think that's important for us to hold, because we spend a lot of times trying to win. We spend a lot of times trying to find best outcomes. We spend a lot of times trying to find solutions. And sometimes they just don't exist. You can do everything right and still lose. and that's I almost said that's okay, but I had to stop myself.
That's good.
Well,
Good job good job sneaking a Star Trek quote in here, Drew. I think that might be the first of our webinars we do that. Hey, Drew, I just want to call your attention to, we have about 15 minutes left, and I know you have a couple of other good points I want to make sure we get to. So let's keep going.
So the next thing I want to talk about is the importance of system, which is really boring, but it's really important, right? Is just because every state has different laws, every community has different policies. Your church probably has specific policies, or if you work in a parachurch organization, you have the ways in which you need to do things. And it's important to understand your systems so that you can work within it. For instance, some of you are going to be mandated reporters. Some states do not require religious leaders or religious workers to be mandated reporters. I think they should, but they don't. And it's really, really, like, if you don't understand your system, you're going to have a hard time navigating it. If the first time you need to call Child Protective Services is when you have a crisis that's happening in real time, it's going to be a lot harder, right? Now, it's weird for me to talk about this because I actually don't have a lot of really good systems in our context. There are times when I call the police department and they just don't pick up. There are times when I call emergency health services and it's an answering machine. And so, like, that is not the ideal. Like, I hope your system is better than that, right? I hope that, when you dial the number, like, people show up, but that's not always true in my case. And so I've had to learn to navigate my system. What are your state's mandated reporter laws? Know them well. What are your church policies around referral? Referral is so important for people. I do not have the luxury of referral in most cases, but you likely do, right? So if you are dealing with, if there's a kid in mental health crisis, if there's a kid who's a suicide risk, and you are not trained to deal with students who are in a suicide risk, don't try, right? There are students, or there are people in your community, in your context, who are experts in that. There are students, or there are people who are experts in, there are rehabs where people can gain tools. If your church is not a rehab, don't try to be, right? And like, it's just super important that you know where your lane is and you try and stay there, right? And again, we don't always like that as youth workers. We don't always like that we don't get to see it through to the end, but like, we have a particular skill set and like, we should live in that skill set, and like, and don't try and do everything yourself, right? Refer when you can. You should have in your office or workplace easy access to, like, what is the non-emergency number for the state troopers and the local police department? What is the number for Child Protective Services? Are there specific people in your context? Are there rehabs? Are there family counselors? Are there school counselors? Are there mental health professionals? Just, do you have those numbers at hand? Because when you need them, you don't want to have to find them. You want to know where they are. And I think it's important to ask yourself some questions too, like, do you know how to do a hospital visitation, right? Do you know, like, go and just ask. Go to wherever your students would end up in the hospital, go and ask, like, if I wanted to do a visitation, what's the process, right? What's the process for that? How do I do that? How does a funeral work? Do you have a framework for that? Does your church have a framework for that? Because I think that that's important. You are so loud. You're so loud.
She likes being on camera.
They're happy noises, I promise. And another nerd reference that I'll throw in is, I really think it's important for you to remember that you are not Batman. If you are not trained, if you are not skilled, if you are not called to work with kids and families in crisis, don't attempt to be. Get them to the people who are trained, who are skilled, who are called. I would argue that Bruce Wayne could do a lot more for Gotham than Batman could if he empowered skilled people in his own context. Batman is cool, but is he effective? And I think, the show's been on for 40 years and Gotham's still in crisis. So I don't think Batman's killing it. Right? So yeah, just live into your calling and let other people live into theirs. Live into your skills. Let other people live into theirs. What training do you need to do what you're called to? Maybe you are called to go and work in a juvenile detention center, to go and minister there. Is there specific training you need to do that? Maybe you are called to get a counseling degree to work specifically with families in crisis. Put the work in. Don't be a Swiss Army knife. Be a specialist, and let other people be a specialist as well, as much as you can, as much as your context allows, as much as your system allows. But it's really important to understand your systems. So, and then the last thing, we've got about 5 minutes left. The last thing I'll talk about is to take care of yourself. Put your own oxygen mask on before assisting others. A lot of times I will tell new youth workers, especially youth workers who are working in difficult contexts, do what you need to do to be a person. Because it's really easy to be, especially in a context where there's a lot of crisis or constant crisis, or just one person who has a specific crisis who occupies a lot of your particular time. Do what you need to do to be a person, and don't feel bad about that. Right? So what do you need? Do you need a nap? Do you need a snack? Do you need to go to the movies? Right? Take care of yourself. Find a time when you do not pick up your phone, when you will not answer the phone. Take time off. Sing. And really, really ask yourself the question, how are you taking care of yourself? What brings you life? Because you need to be doing those things. 2 Corinthians 1:4, who comforts us in our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any affliction. You're very distracting. With the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. Working harder won't ease things. Stepping back is often what's needed. Also, residual trauma is a very real thing if you're dealing with constant crisis. 10 years ago, I was not on anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication. I am now. There's a cost. There's a cost to things. Which is why it's important to stay in your lane, stay in your skill set, because it will take things from you. And I don't say that as like a bad thing. Like I have been called to this context. I feel that very clearly. I love the people I work with, but it doesn't mean that things aren't hard. It doesn't mean that I don't need to deal with some very specific realities, because stuff's gonna come at you sideways, and do what you need to do to be a person. Go to counseling, get medication, normalize the importance of mental health care, both for yourself, for your staff, for your youth group. A lot of places don't feel like they're allowed to talk about mental health still, but we should be. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is just do your best. Really, there's no cookie cutter answers. There's no one size fits all, but do your best. Stuff will come at you sideways. You will be presented with things you were never trained for. Do your best, even if it's not perfect, because you're a person and you're allowed to be. So.
Thank you, Drew.
And just for those in the chat, I'll throw my email in there real quick, just in case people want to connect later on. I'm happy to do that. I love connecting with people in this space. I love connecting with youth workers who are dealing with hard things. I don't shy away from hard things. A lot of times, my wife and I tell our students we are very difficult people to shock. um, and so if you have stuff that you're dealing with that you don't know how to deal with, feel free to reach out. There are those of us who do it often, and would like to help. So
That's great. I also pasted in the links and stuff, the resources that were at the end of your document, and we'll post this. And I think we even talked about posting your notes along with this. So we'll get that done when we post. If we have, do have a couple more minutes for Q&A. So if you have a question for Drew, go ahead and put it in the chat. I have one to kind of get the ball rolling. In your experience, do you have any wisdom or insight in dealing with students or leaders or families that seem like they're perpetually in crisis? And maybe ones that have like the smaller kind of things that they're always in crisis over. Maybe because they get attention from it and they like getting that attention. Maybe they're an over worrier, or those people that kind of like tend to take a lot of our emotional energy. Any advice for that situation?
Yeah, and I would say that it's part of why it's important for time off is because there are those people who are kind of like they're energy vampires, and it's just like when it's like a lot of little crisis. I think having good boundaries also helps, because if you're very clear about the things you can and can't solve, it might make some of those things just go away on their own, especially if you're like, oh, it sounds like you're dealing with I don't know, anxiety. Have you talked to your doctor about anxiety? And just like little things like that. Again, going back to that conversation on sympathy, of like, it's very real for them. Like, to you, they're coming with the same thing they've come with for the last 6 weeks. They're saying the exact same stuff. You're giving them the exact same pieces of advice, and you're just annoyed. But to them, it's a very real crisis. Their emotions are very real. And so dealing with it in that way of not addressing necessarily the issue that's being talked about, but what is the emotion, and meeting them in that space. I think is more helpful. But again, like, if they know that you're not the person who fixes that issue, they're probably not going to come to you, right? If you have other resources, be like, man, let me get you connected with so and so who I think would be able to help, right? It might assuage that a little bit. And I think some people just need somebody to listen. A lot of people, life is really hard and life is really busy, and you are a safe person in a slow space, in a space that is slowed down. And people feel like they have time. You might not feel like you have time, but when people come into churches, they often feel like they have time to unpack things, to address things. And like, are we making space for that? Are we accounting for that? Or are we just constantly annoyed because we're not accounting for that? And if someone's coming to you, and they're coming to you often, it's likely that is your ministry in some way. And be careful, because there's ways that things can get out of hand, but and discernment, which comes back to discernment, and particularly group discernment. Do you have a good relationship with your senior pastor to be like, man, this person is sucking all my time away. How do I deal with this? Is there someone we can connect this particular person with, because I am not the person who can solve their issues, but they keep coming to me. Don't try and solve things by yourself. So hopefully some of that's helpful.
No, that's really helpful. That's great. Yeah, because I don't think any of us would be in youth ministry if we weren't aware of the fact that our teenage years often are crisis years, and even in the calmest, healthiest family system or friend group or whatever the teenager is in, the issues they face will be exaggerated because of their what's going on in their physical bodies, and there's just a ongoing sense of crisis in most teenagers' lives, and so that's what we're here for. We want to help them. We want to help be Jesus, to them, for them in those situations, and to do that well while not being overwhelmed ourselves is a challenge. It's a skill, and it seems like you've learned it well a lot, and I'm really grateful for your sharing that with us today. So I don't see any more questions in the chat, and so I think we'll go ahead and move towards wrapping up. Is there any last words, any last little tidbits of wisdom or hope you want to offer our listeners?
Just keep going. We've been every day feels like a new unprecedented time, right? Since COVID, the level of crisis has skyrocketed for people, and we're living in that space. We're living in that space with people, and so take care of yourselves. Get the training you need. Keep showing up, I think, is another important thing. And if you're here, or if you're watching this after the fact, you're trying, and sometimes that's enough. And so yeah, that's all I'll say.
Good. Well, thank you again, Drew. It's great having you on, and Zoe, it's great to have you on as well. We'll be watching your development with great interest. There's a Star Wars reference I put in there. So got three sci-fi or nerd references we snuck in there. Good.
My people.
Great. Well, thanks, Drew. We're praying for you, especially as you get ready for camp this summer. I know you got a lot going on. I appreciate you taking the time. And if this is your first time with us at CovYouth 101, don't forget to check out our other webinars also on CovYouth in the same space you found this one. And check out the notes and links that will be accompanying this video in CovYouth 101, probably right below where you're watching right now. And otherwise, we'll see you next time. Thanks again, Drew.
Cool beans, man.